Hello, darling. Tonight, I invite you to step a little deeper into the dark with me. Not a comforting dark of a quiet room, but the kind that watches from the edges of the trees, where the wind carries whispers older than memory. Our tale comes from the shadowed imagination of H.P. Lovecraft, a master of dread who understood that the most terrible things in the world are rarely seen clearly, only felt. Just beyond the edge of the lantern's glow, high in the lonely mountains beneath storm-torn skies, stands a place long abandoned, a place their villagers speak only in frightened murmurs. They call it Tempest Mountain, and they say something moves there when the thunder rolls, something that waits. So settle in close, darling. Let the fire burn low, let the night grow quiet, and listen carefully, because some fears do not sleep, they lurk. Tonight's story is The Lurking Fear. There was thunder in the air on the night I went to the deserted mansion atop Tempest Mountain to find the lurking fear. I was not alone, for the foolhardiness was not then mixed with the love of the grotesque, the terrible, which had made my career a series of quests for strange horrors in literature and in life. With me were two faithful and muscular men for whom I had sent when the time came, men long associated with me in my ghastly explorations because of their peculiar fitness. We had started quietly from the village because of the reporters who still lingered about after the eldritch panic of the month before, the nightmare of creeping death. Later, I thought, they might aid me, but I did not want them then. Would to God I had let them share the search, that I might not have had to bear the secret alone so long, to bear it alone for fear the world would call me mad, or go mad itself at the demon implications of the thing. Now that I am telling it anyway, lest the brooding make me a maniac, I wish I had never concealed it, for I, and I only, know what manner of fear lurked on that spectral and desolate mountain. In a small motor car, we covered the miles of primeval forest and hill until the wooded ascent checked it. The country bore an aspect more than usually sinister as we viewed it by night and without the accustomed crowds of investigators, so that we were often tempted to use the acetylene headlights despite the attention it might attract. It was not a wholesome landscape after dark, and I believe I would have noticed its morbidity even had I been ignorant of the terror that stalked there. Of wild creature there were none. They are wise even when death leers close. The ancient lightning-scarred trees seemed unnaturally large and twisted, and the other vegetation unnaturally thick and feverish, while curious mounds of hummocks in the weedy, figurative-pitted earth reminded me of snakes and dead man's skulls, swelled to gigantic proportions. Fear had lurked on Tempest Mountain for more than a century. This I learned at once from the newspaper accounts of the catastrophe which first brought the region to the world's notice. The place, a remote, lonely elevation in the part of the Catskills where Dutch civilizations once feebly and transiently penetrated, leaving behind as they receded only a few ruined mansions and a degenerate squatter population inhabiting pitiful hamlets on isolated slopes. Normal beings seldom visited the locality till the state police were formed, and even now only infrequent troopers patrolled it. The fear, however, is an old tradition throughout the neighboring villages. since it is a prime topic in the simple discourse of the poor mongrels who sometimes leave their alleys to trade hand-woven baskets for such primitive necessities as they cannot shoot, raise, or make. The lurking fear dwelt in the shunned and deserted Martese mansion, which crowned the high but gradual eminence whose liability to frequent thunderstorms gave it the name of Tempest Mountain. For over 100 years, the antique grove-circled stone house had been the subject of stories, incredibly wild and monstrously hideous, stories of a silent, colossal, creeping death which stalked abroad in summer. With whimpering insistence, the squatters told tales of a demon which seized lone wayfarers after dark, either carrying them off or leaving them in a frightening state of gnawed dismemberment. While sometimes they whispered of blood trails toward the distant mansion, some said the thunder called the lurking fear out of its habitation, while others said the thunder was its voice. No one outside the backwoods had believed these varying and conflicting stories with their incoherent, extravagant descriptions of the half-glimpsed fiend, yet not a farmer or a villager doubted that the Martins mansion was ghoulishly haunted. Local history forbade such a doubt, although no ghostly evidence was ever found by such investigators as had visited the building after some especially vivid tales of the squatters. Grandmothers told strange myths of the Martins specter, myths concerning the Martins family itself, its queer hereditary dissimilarity of eyes, its long, unnatural annals, and the murder which had cursed it. The terror which brought me to the scene was a sudden and portentous confirmation of the mountaineers' wildest legends. One summer night, after a thunderstorm of unprecedented violence, the countryside was aroused by a squatter stampede which no mere delusion could create. The pitiful throngs of natives shrieked and whined of the unnameable horror which had descended upon them, and they were not doubted. They had not seen it, but had heard such cries from one of their hamlets that they knew a creeping death had come. In the morning, citizens and state troopers followed the shuddering mountaineers to the place where they said the death had come. Death was indeed there. The ground under one of the squatters' villages had caved in after a lightning strike, destroying several of the malodorous shanties. But upon this property damage was superimposed an organic devastation which paled it to insignificance. Of a possible 75 natives who had inhabited the spot, not one living specimen was visible. The disordered earth was covered with blood and human debris, bespeaking too vividly the ravages of demon teeth and talons, yet no visible trail led away from the carnage. That some hideous animal must be the cause, everyone quickly agreed, nor did any tongue now revive the charge that some cryptic death formed merely the sordid murders common in decadent communities. That charge was revived only then about 25 of the estimated population were found missing from the dead. And even then, it was hard to explain the murder of 50 by half that number. But the fact remained that on a summer night, a bolt had come out of the heavens and left a dead village whose corpses were horribly mangled, chewed, and clawed. The excited countryside immediately connected the horror with the haunted Martins mansion, though the localities were over 3 miles apart. The troopers were more skeptical, including the mansion only casually in their investigations, and dropping it altogether when they found it thoroughly deserted. Country and village people, however, canvassed the place with infinite care, overturning everything in the house, sounding ponds and brooks, beating down brushes, ransacking the nearby forest. All was in vain. The death that had come had left no trace save destruction itself. By the second day of the search, the affairs were fully treated by the newspapers whose reporters overran Tempest Mountain. They described it as such detail, and with many interviews to elucidate the horror's history as told by local Gandams. I followed the accounts languidly at first, for I am a connoisseur in horrors, but after a week I detected an atmosphere which stirred me oddly, so that on August 5th, 1921, I registered among the reporters who crowded the hotel at Leftist Corners, nearest village to Tempest Mountain, and acknowledged headquarters of the searchers. 3 weeks more, and the disperser of the reporters left me free to begin a terrible exploration based on the minute inquiries and surveying with which I had meanwhile busied myself. And so, on the summer night, while distant thunder rumbled, I left a silent motor car and trampled with 2 armed companions up the mound-covered reaches of Tempest Mountain, casting the beams of an electric torch on the spectral gray walls that began to appear through the giant oaks ahead. In this morbid night solitude and feeble shifting illumination, the vast box-like pile displayed obscure hints of terror which they could not uncover, yet I did not hesitate. While I had come from fierce resolutions to test an idea, I believed that the thunder called the death demon out of some fearsome secret place, and be that demon solid entity or vaporous pestilence, I meant to see it. I had thoroughly searched the ruins before, hence knew my plan well, choosing as the seat of my vigil the old room of Jan Martise, whose murder looms so great in rural legends. I felt subtly that the apartment of this ancient victim was best for my purposes. The chamber, measuring about 20 feet square, contained, like the other rooms, some rubbish, which had once been furniture. It lay on the second story, on the southeast corner of the house, which had an immense east window and narrow south window, both devoid of panes or shutters. Opposite the large window was an enormous Dutch fireplace, with scriptural tiles representing the prodigal son, and opposite the narrow window was a spacious bed built into the wall. As the tree-muffled thunder grew louder, I arranged my plan details. First I fastened, side by side on the ledge of the large window, 3 rope ladders, which I had brought with me. I knew they reached suitable spot on the grass outside, for I had tested them. Then the 3 of us dragged from the other room a wide 4-poster bedstead, crowding it laterally against the window, having strewn it and with its fir boughs, all now rested on. It was of drawn automatics, 2 relaxing, while the 3rd watched. From whatever direction the demon might come, our potential escape was provided. If it came from within the house, we had the window ladders. If it came from outside, the door and the stairs. We did not think, judging from precedent, that it would pursue us far, even at worst. I watched from midnight to 1 o'clock, when, in spite of the sinister house, the unprotected window, and the approaching thunder and lightning, I felt singularly drowsy. I was between my 2 companions, George Bennett being toward the window and William Toby toward the fireplace. Bennett was asleep, having apparently felt the same anomalous drowsiness which affected me. So I designated Toby for the next watch, although even as he was nodding, it is curious how intently I would have been watching the fireplace. The increasing thunder must have affected my dreams, for in the brief time I slept, there came to me apocalyptic visions. Once I partly awakened, probably because of the sleeper toward the window, had restlessly flung an arm across my chest. I was not sufficiently awake to see whether Toby was attending to his duties as sentinel, but felt a distinct anxiety on that score. Never before had the presence of evil so potently oppressed me. Later, I must have dropped asleep again, for it was out of a phantasmal chaos that my mind leaped from the night, grew hideous, with shrieks beyond anything in my former experience or imagination. And that shrieking, the innermost soul of human fear and agony, clawed hopelessly and insanely at the ebony gates of oblivion. I awoke to red madness and the mockery of diabolism as farther and farther down inconceivable vistas that phobic as crystalline anguish retreated and reverberated. There was no light, but I knew from the empty space at my right that Toby was gone. God alone knew where. Across my chest still lay the heavy arm of the sleeper at my left. Then came the devastating stroke of lightning, which shook the whole mountain, lit the darkest crypts of the hoary grave, and splintered the patriarch of the twisted trees. In the demon flash of monstrous fireball, the sleeper stirred up suddenly, while the glare from beyond the window threw his shadow vividly across the chimney above the fireplace, from which my eyes have never strayed. That I am still alive and sane is a marvel I could not fathom. For the shadow on that chimney was not that of George Bennet or any other human creature, but a blasphemous abnormality from hell's nethermost craters, a nameless, shapeless abomination, which no mind could fully grasp and no pen could partly describe. In another second, I was alone in the accursed mansion, shivering and gibbering. George Bennet and William Toby had left no trace, not even a struggle. It was like they were never there. They were never heard from again. For days after that hideous experience in the forest-swathed mansion, I lay nervously exhausted in my hotel room at Lafayette Corners. I do not remember exactly how I managed to reach the motor car, start it, and slip unobserved back to the village, where I retained no distinct impression save of wild-armed titan trees, demonic mutterings of thunder, and cherishing shadows thwarted the low mounds and dotted streaked region. As I shivered and brooded on the casting of the brain-lasting shadows, I knew that I had at last pried out one of the earth's supreme horrors, one of those nameless blights of outer voids, whose faint demon scratchings we sometimes heard on the farthest rims of space, yet from which we own finite visions had given us a merciful immunity. The shadow I had seen, I hardly dared to analyze or identify. Something had lain between me and the window that night, but I shuddered whenever I could not cast off the instinct to classify it. If it had only snarled, or bayed, or laughed titteringly, even that would have relieved the abysmal hideousness. But it was so silent. It had rested a heavy arm or foreleg on my chest. Obviously, it was organic, or had once been organic. Jan Martise, whose room I had invaded, was buried in the graveyard near the mansion. I must find Bennet and Toby. If they lived, why had it picked them and left me for the last? Drowsiness is so stifling and dreams are so terrible. In a short time, I realized I must tell my story to someone or break down completely. I had already decided not to abandon the quest for the lurking fear, for in my rash ignorance it seemed to me that uncertainty was worse than enlightenment, however terrible the latter might prove to be. Accordingly, I revoked in my mind the best course to pursue, whom to select for my confidences, and how to track down the thing which had obliterated 2 men and cast a nightmare shadow. My chief acquaintances at Leftist Corners had been the affable reporters, of whom several still remained to collect final echoes of the tragedy. It was from there that I determined to choose a colleague, and the more I reflected, the more my preference inclined toward one Arthur Monroe, a dark, lean man of about 35, whose education, taste, intelligence, and temperament all seemed to mark him as not bound to conventional ideas and experiences. On the afternoon of September, Arthur Monroe listened to my story. I saw from the beginning that he was both interested and sympathetic, and when I had finished, he analyzed and discussed the things with the greatest shrewdness and judgment. His advice, moreover, was eminently practical, for he recommended a postponement of operations at the Martise mansion until we might become fortified with more detailed historic and geographical data. On his initiative, we combined the countryside for information regarding the terrible Martinez family and discovered a man who possessed a marvelously illuminating ancestral diary. We also talked in length with such the mountain mongrels as had not fled from the terror and confusion to remoter slopes, and arranged to proceed our illuminating task, the exhaustive and definitive examination of the mansion in the light of a detailed history, with an equally exhaustive and definitive examination of spots associated with the various tragedies of a squatter legend. The results of this examination were not at first very enlightening, though our tabulation of them seemed to reveal a fairly significant trend, namely, that the number of reported horrors was by far the greatest in area, either comparatively near the avoided house or connected with it by stretches of the morbidly overnourished forest. There were, it is true, exceptions. Indeed, the horror which had caught the world's ear had happened in a treeless space remote alike from the mansion and from any connecting woods. As the nature of an appearance of the lurking fear, nothing could be gained from the sacred and Whitley shanty dwellers. In the same breath, they called it a snake and a giant, a thunder devil and a bat, a vulture and a walking tree. We did, however, deem ourselves justified in assuming that it was a living organism, highly susceptible to electrical storms. And although certain of the stories suggested, we believed, that its aversion for the open spaces made land, locomotion, a more probable theory. The only thing really incompatible with the latter view was the rapidity with which the creature must have traveled in order to perform all the deeds attributed to it. When we came to know the squatters better, we found them curiously likable in many ways. Simple animals they were, gently descending the evolutionary scale because of their unfortunate ancestry and stultifying isolation. They feared outsiders, but slowly grew accustomed to us, finally helping vastly when we beat down all the thickets and tore out all the partitions of the mansion in our search for the lurking fear. When we asked them to help us find Bennett and Toby, they were truly distressed, for they wanted to help us, yet knew that these victims had gone as wholly out of the world as their own missing people, that great numbers of them had actually been killed and removed, but as the wild animals had been long exterminated, We were, of course, thoroughly convinced, and we waited apprehensively for further tragedy to occur. In the middle of October, we were puzzled by our lack of progress. Owing to the clear nights, no demonic aggressions had taken place, and the completeness of our vain searches of house and country almost drove us to regard the lurking fear as a non-material agency. We feared that the cold weather would come. It would come on and it would halt our explorations, for all agreed that the demon had generally been quiet in the winter. Thus, there was a kind of haste and desperation in our last daylight canvass of the horror-visited hamlet, a hamlet now deserted because of the squatter's fears. The ill-fated squatter's hamlet had borne no name, but had long stood in shelter through treeless cleft between two elevations, called respectively Cone Mountain and Maple Hill. It was closer to Maple Hill than to Cone Mountain, some of the crude abodes indeed being dugouts on the side of a former eminence. Geographically, it lay about 2 miles northwest of the base of Tempest Mountain and 3 miles from the oak-girt mansion. Of the distance between the hamlet and the mansion, fully 2 miles and a quarter on the hamlet side was entirely open country, the plain being of fairly level character, save for some of the low snake-like mounds, and having as vegetation only grass and scattered weeds. Considering this topography, we finally concluded that the demon must have come by way of Cone Mountain, a wooded southern prolongation of which ran to within the short distance of the westernmost spur of Tempest Mountain. The upheaval of ground we traced conclusively to a landslide from Maple Hill, a tall, lone, splintered tree on whose side had been the striking point of the thunderbolt which summoned the fiend. On the 20th time or more, Arthur Monroe and I went minutely over every inch of the violated village. We were filled with a certain discouragement, coupled with vague and novel fears. It was acutely uncanny, even when frightened and uncanny things were common, to encounter so blankly clueless a scene after such overwhelming occurrences, and we moved from beneath the leaden, darkened sky with a tragic directionless zeal, which resulted from a combined sense of futility and necessity of action. Our care was gravely minute. Every cottage was again entered, every hillside dug out again, searched for bodies, every thorny foot of adjacent slope again scanned for dens and caves, but all without result. And yet, as I have said, vague new fears hovered menacingly over us, as if giant bat wings, griffins squatted invisibly on the mountain tops and leered with apenine eyes that had looked on transonic gulfs. As the afternoon advanced, it became increasingly difficult to see, and we heard the rumble of thunder, a thunderstorm, gathering over Tempest Mountain. This sound, in such a locality, naturally stirred us, though less than it would have done at night. As it was, we hoped desperately that the storm would last until well after dark, and with that hope, turned from our aimless hillside searching toward the nearest inhabited hamlet to gather a body of squatters as helpers in the investigation. Timid as they were, a few of the younger men were sufficiently inspired by our protective leadership to promise such help. We had hardly more than turned, however, when there descended such a blinding sheet of torrential rain that shelter became imperative. The extreme, almost nocturnal darkness of the sky caused us to stumble sadly, but guided by the frequent flashes of lightning and by our minute knowledge of the hamlet, we soon reached the last and least poorest cabin of the lot. An heterogeneous combination of logs and boards, whose still existing door and single tiny window both faced Maple Hill. Barring the door after us, against the fury of the wind and rain, we put in place the crude window shutter which our frequent searches had taught us where to find. It was dismal sitting there on rickety boxes on the pitchy darkness, but we smoked pipes and occasionally flashed our pocket lamps about. Now and then we could see the lightning through cracks in the wall. The afternoon was so incredibly dark, and each flash was extremely vivid. Storm vigils reminded me shudderingly of my ghastly night on Tempest Mountain. My mind turned to that odd question which had kept reoccurring ever since the nightmare thing had happened. And again, I wondered why the demon approaching the three watchers, either from the window or the interior, had begun with the men on each side and left the middleman until the last, when the Titan fireball had scared it away. Why had it not taken its victims in natural order, with myself second, from whichever direction it had approached? With what manner of far-reaching tentacles did it prey? Or did it know that I was a leader and saved me for a fate worse than that of my companions? In the midst of the reflections, as it dramatically arranged to intensify them, there fell near by a terrific bolt of lightning, followed by the sound of sliding earth. At the same time, the wolfish wind rose to demonic crescendos of ululation. We were sure that the lone tree on Maple Hill had been struck again, and Monroe rose from his box and went to the tiny window to ascertain the damage. When he looked, the shutter, the window, and rain howled definitely in, so that I could not hear what he said. But I waited while he leaned out and tried to fathom nature's pandemonium. Gradually, a calming of the wind and dispersal of the unusual darkness told of the storm's passing. I had hoped it would last until the night to help our quest, but a furtive sunbeam from a knothole behind me removed the likelihood of such a thing, suggesting to Monroe that we had better get some light, even if more showers came. I unbarred and opened the crude door. The ground outside was a singular mass of mud and pools, and fresh heaps of earth from the slight landslide. But I saw nothing to justify the interest, which kept my companion silently leaning out the window. Crossing to where he leaned, I touched his shoulder, but he did not move. Then, as I playfully shook him and turned him around, I felt the strangling tendrils of a cancerous horror whose roots reached into inimitable parts and fathomless abysms of the night that broods beyond time. For Arthur Monroe was dead, and on that remained of his chewed and gouged head there was no longer a face. On the tempest-racked night of November 18, 1921, with a lantern which cast charnel shadows, I stood digging alone and idiotically in the grave of Jan Mertes. I had begun to dig in the afternoon because a thunderstorm was brewing, and now that it was dark and the storm had burst above the maniacally thick foliage, I was glad. I believe that in my mind was partly unhinged by the events since August 5th. The demon shadow in the mansion, the general strain and disappointment, and the thing that occurred at the hamlet in October storm. After that thing, I had dug a grave for one whose death I could not understand. I knew that others could not understand either, so let them think Arthur Monroe had wandered away. They searched, but found nothing. The squatters might have understood, but I dared not frighten them more. I myself seemed strangely callous. That shock at the mansion had done something to my brain. I could think only of the quest, for a horror had grown to a cataclysmic stature in my imagination. A quest which the fate of Arthur Monroe made me vow to keep silent and solitary. The scene of my extravagations would alone have been enough to unnerve any ordinary man. Baleful primal trees of unholy size, age, and grotesqueness leered above me like the pillars of some hellish Druidic temple, muffling the thunder, hushing the clawing wind, and emitting but little rain. Beyond the scarred trunks in the background, illuminated by faint flashes of filtered lightning, rose the damp, ivied stones of the deserted mansion, while somewhere near the abandoned Dutch garden, whose walks and beds were polluted by a white fungus fetid overnourished vegetation that never saw full daylight, and nearest of all was the graveyard, where deformed trees tossed insane branches as their roots displaced unhallowed slabs and sucked venom from what lay below. Now and then, beyond and beneath the brown pall of leaves that rotted and festered in the antediluvian forest, darkness, I could trace the sinister outlines of some of these low mounds which characterized the lightning-pierced region. History had led me to this archaic grave. History, indeed, was all I had after everything else ended in mocking Satanism. I now believe that the lurking fear was no material thing but a wolf-fanged ghost that rode the midnight lightning, and I believed, because of the masses of local tradition I'd unearthed in my search with Arthur Monroe, that the ghost was that of Jean Martinez, who died in 1762. That is why I was digging idiotically in his grave. The Martinez mansion was built in 1670 by Gerrit Martinez, a wealthy New Amsterdam merchant, who disliked the changing order under British rule, and who had constructed this magnificent domicile of a remote woodland summit whose untrodden solitude and unusual scenery pleased him. The only substantial disappointment encountered in this site was that which concerned the prevalence of violent thunderstorms in summer. When selected the hill and building his mansion, Mynheer Martinez had laid these frequent natural outbursts to some peculiarity of the year. But in time, he perceived that the locality was especially liable to such phenomena. At length, having found these storms infurious to his head, he lifted up a cellar into which he could retreat from their wildest pandemonium. Of Gerrit Martinez's descendants, less is known than of himself, since they were all reared in hatred of the English civilization, and trained to shun such of the colonists as accepted it. Their life was exceedingly secluded, and people declared that their isolation had made them heavy of speech and comprehension. In appearance, they were marked by a peculiar inherited dissimilarity of eyes, last they took to intermarrying with numerous venial classes about the estate. Many of the crowded family degenerated and moved across the valley and merged with the mongrel population, which was later to produce the pitiful squatters. The rest had stuck sullenly to their ancestral mansion, becoming more and more clannish and taciturn, yet developing a nervous responsiveness to the frequent thunderstorms. Most of the information reached the outside world through young Jean Martinez, who, from some kind of restlessness, joined the colonial army when news of the Albany Convention reached Tempest Mountain. He was the first of the Jarrett's descendants to see much of the world, and when he returned in 1760, after 6 years of campaigning, he was hated as an outsider by his father, uncles, and brothers, in spite of his dissimilar Martinese eyes. No longer could he share the peculiarities and prejudices of the Martinese, while the very mountain thunderstorms failed to intoxicate him as they had before. Instead, his surroundings depressed him, and he frequently wrote to a friend in Albany of plans to leave the paternal roof. In the spring of 1763, Jonathan Gifford, the Albany friend of Jan Martinez, became worried by his correspondent's silence, especially in view of the condition and quarrels of the Martinez mansion. Determined to visit Jan in person, he went into the mountain on horseback. His diary states that he reached the Tempest Mountain on September 20th, finding the mansion in great decrepitude. The sullen, odd-eyed Martinez, whose unclean animal aspect shook him, told him in broken gutturals that Jan was dead. He had, they insisted, been struck by lightning the autumn before, and now lay buried behind the neglected sunken gardens. They showed the visitor the grave, barren and devoid of markers. Something in the Martinez manner gave Gifford a feeling of repulsion and suspicion, and a week later he returned with spade and mattock and to explore the spectral spot. He found what he had expected, a skull crushed cruelly in by their ravaging blows. So, returning to Albany, he openly charged the Martinez with the murder of their kinsman. Legal evidence was lacking, but the story spread rapidly around the countryside, and from that time the Martinez were ostracized by the world. No one would deal with them, and their distant manor was shunned as a cursed place. Somehow they managed to live on independently by the products of their estate, for occasional lights glimpsed from faraway hills attested their continued presence. Their lights had seen in late 1810, but toward the last they became very infrequent. Meanwhile, they grew up about the mansion and the mountain, a body, diabolic legendary. The place was avoided with double assiduousness and invested with every whispered myth tradition could supply. It remained unvisited till 1816, when the continued absence of lights was noticed by the squatters. By that time, a party made investigations, finding the house and deserted and partly in ruins. There were no skeletons about, so that departure rather than death was inferred. The clans seemed to have left several years before, and improvised penthouses to show the numerous it had grown prior to its migration. Its cultural level had fallen very low, proved by decaying furniture and scattered silverware, which must have been long abandoned when its owners left. But though the dreaded Martinez were gone, the fear of the haunted house continued and grew very acute when new and strange stories arose among the mountain descendants. There it stood, deserted, feared, and linked with the vengeful ghost of Jan Martinez. There it still stood on the night I dug into Jan Martinez's grave. I have described my protracted digging as idiotic, and such it indeed was an objective method. The coffin of Jan Martinez had been soon unearthed. It now held only dust and litter. But in my fury to exhume his ghost, I delved irrationally, and I clumsily went down beneath there where he had lain. God knows what I expected to find. I only felt that I was digging in the grave of a man whose ghost stalked at night. It is impossible to say what monstrous depths I had obtained when my spade and soon my feet broke through the ground beneath. The event, under the circumstance, was tremendous. We're in the existence of a subterranean space. Here, my mad theories had terrible confirmation. My slight fall had extinguished the lantern, but I produced an electric pocket lamp and viewed the small horizontal tunnel which led away indefinitely in both directions. It was amply large for a man to wriggle through, and though no sane person would have tried it at that time, I forgot danger, reason, and cleanliness, and in my single-minded fever to unearth the lurking fear, I forgot it all. Choosing the direction toward the house, I scrambled recklessly into the narrow burrow, squirming ahead blindly and rapidly, and flashing but seldom the lamp I kept before me. The language can describe the spectacle of a man lost in infinitely abysmal earth, pawing, twisting, wheezing, scrambling madly through sunken convulsions of immemorial blackness, without an idea of time, safety, direction, of infinite object. There is something hideous in it, but that is what I did. I did it for so long that life faded to a far memory and became one with the moles and grubs and nighted depths. Indeed, it was only by accident that after immeasurable writhings, I jarred my forgotten electric lamp alight so that it shone eerily down the burrow of caked loam and stretched and curved ahead. I had been scrambling in this way for some time, so that my battery had burned very low when the passage suddenly inclined sharply upward, altering my mode of progress. And as I raised my glance, it was without preparation that I saw glistening in the distance 2 demonic reflections of my expiring lamp. 2 reflections glowing with a baneful and unmistakable effulgence, and provoking maddeningly nebulous memories. I stood automatically, though lacking the brain to retreat. The eyes approached, yet of the thing that bore them I could distinguish only a claw. But what a claw! Then, far overhead, I heard a faint crashing which I recognized. It was the wild thunder of the mountain, raised to hysteric fury. I must have been crawling upward for some time, so that the surface was now quite near, and in the muffled thunder clattered, those eyes still stared with voracious viciousness. Thank God I did not know now what it was, else I would have died. But I was saved by the very thunder that had summoned it, for after a hideous wait, there burst out the unseen outside sky one of those frequent mountainward bolts, whose aftermath I had noticed here and there as gashes of disturbed earth and cruelties of various sizes. With cyclopean rage, it tore through the soil above the damnable pit, blinding and deafening me, yet not wholly reducing me to a coma. In the chaos of sliding, shifting earth, I clawed and floundered helplessly, till the rain on my head steadied me, and I saw that I had come to the surface in a familiar spot, a steep, unforested place on the southwest slope of the mountain. Recurrent sheet lightnings illuminated the fumbling ground and the remains of the curious low hummock which had stretched down from the wooded higher slope, but there was nothing in the chaos to show my place of egress from the lethal catacomb. My brain was as great a chaos as the earth, and as distant red glare burst on the landscape from the south. I hardly realized the horror I had been through. But then, 2 days later, the squatters told me what the red glare meant. I felt more horror than that which the mold burrow and the claw and eyes had given. More horror because of the overwhelming implication. In a hamlet 20 miles away, an orgy of fear had followed the bolt which brought me from above the ground. and a nameless thing had dropped from an overhanging tree into a weak-roofed cabin. It had done a deed, but the squatters had fired the cabin in frenzy before it could escape. It had been doing that deed at the very moment the earth caved in on the thing with the claw and eyes. There can be nothing normal in the mind of one who knows what I knew of the horrors of Tempest Mountain, who seek alone for the fear of lurking there. That at least two of the fear's embodiments were destroyed formed but a slight guarantee of mental and physical safety in this Archeon of multiform diabolism. Yet I continued my quest with greater zeal as events and revelations became more monstrous. Then, when 2 days after my frightful crawl through the crypt of the eye and claw, I learned that a thing had malignly hovered 20 miles away at the same instant the eyes were glaring at me. I experienced virtual convulsions of fright, but that fright was so mixed with wonder and alluring grotesqueness that it was almost a pleasant sensation. Sometimes in the throes of a nightmare, when unforeseen powers whirled over roofs of strange dead cities toward the grinning chasm of Nis, it is a relief that even a delight to shriek wildly and throw oneself voluntarily along the hideous vortex of dream doom down into the whatever bottomless gulf may yawn. And so it was with the walking nightmare of Tempest Mountain. The discovery that two monsters had haunted the spot gave me ultimately a mad craving to plunge into the very earth of the accursed region. One with bare hands to dig out the earth that was leery from every inch of the poisonous soil. As soon as possible, I visited the grave of Jan Martinez and dug vainly where I had dug before. Some extensive cave-in had obliterated all traces of the underground passage, while the rain had washed so much earth back into the excavation that I could not tell how deeply I had dug that other day. I likewise made a difficult trip to the distant hamlet where the death creature had been burnt, and was little repaid for my trouble. In the ashes of the fateful cabin, I found several bones, but apparently none of the monsters. The squatters said the thing had only one victim, but in this I judged them inaccurate, since besides the complete skull of a human being, there was another bony fragment, which seemed certainly to have belonged to a human skull at some point. Though the rapid drop of the monster had been seen, no one could say just what the creature was like. Those who had glimpsed it called it simply a devil, examining the great tree where it lurked. I could discern no distinctive marks. I tried to find some trail to the Black Forest, but on the occasion could not stand the night of those morbidly large bulls, or of those vast serpentine-like brutes, so malevolently before they sank into the earth. My next step was to re-examine with microscopic care the deserted hamlet where death had come most abundantly, and where Arthur Monroe had seen something he never lived to describe. Though my vain previous searches had been exceedingly minute, I now had new data to test, for my horrible grave crawl convinced me that at least one of the phases of the monstrosity had been an underground creature. This time, on the 14th of November, my quest concerned itself mostly with the slopes of Cone Mountain and Maple Hill, where they overlooked the unfortunate hamlet, and I had particular attention to the loose earth of the landslide region of the latter eminence. The afternoon of my search brought nothing to light. The dusk came as I stood on Maple Hill, looked down at the hamlet, and across the valley to Tempest Mountain. There had been a gorgeous sunset, and now, as the moon came up, nearly full and shedding a silver flood over the basin, the direct mountainside and the curious low mounds that rose here and there. It was a peaceful, Arcadian scene, but knowing it hid, I hated it. I hated the mocking moon, the hypocritical plain, the festering mountain, and those sinister mounds. Everything seemed to me tainted with a loathsome contagion, and inspired by a noxious alliance with distorted hidden powers. Presently, as I gazed abstractly at the moonlit panorama, my eyes became attracted by something singular in the nature and arrangement of a certain topographical element. Without having any exact knowledge of geology, I had from the first been interested in the odd mounds and hummocks of the region. I had noticed that they were pretty widely distributed around Tempest Mountain, though less numerous on the plains than near the hilltop itself, where prehistoric glaciation and had doubtlessly found feebler opposition to its striking and fantastic caprices. Now, in the light of that low moon, which cast long, weird shadows, it struck me forcibly that the variable point and lines of those mounds, the whole mound system, had a peculiar relation to the summit of Tempest Mountain. That summit was undeniably a center from which the lines of rows of points radiated indefinitely and irregularly, as if the whole unwholesome Martinez mansion had thrown out invisible tentacles of terror. The idea of such tentacles gave me an unexpected thrill, and I stopped to analyze my reason for believing these mounds glacial phenomena. The more I analyzed, the less I believed, and against my newly opened mind there began to be grotesque and horrible analogies, based on superficial aspects and upon my experience beneath the earth. Before I knew it, I was uttering frenzied and disjointed words to myself. My God, molehills, the damn place could be honeycombed. How many? That night at the mansion, it took Bennett and Toby first, on each side of us. Then I was digging frantically into the mound, which had stretched nearest me, digging desperately, shivering but almost jubilantly, digging at the last shriek aloud, in some unplaced emotion, as I came upon a tunnel or burrow, and just like the one through which I had crawled on that other demonic night. After that, I recalled running, spade in hand, a hideous run across the moonlit, mound-marked meadows, and through diseased precipice abysses and haunted hillsides, forests, leaping, screaming, panting, pounding, bounding toward the terrible Martinez mansion. I recalled digging unreasonably in all parts of the briar-choked cellar, digging to find the core and center of that malignant universe of mounds. And then I recall how I laughed when I stumbled on the passageway, the hole at the base of the old chimney, where the thick weeds grew and cast queer shadows in the light of the lone candle I had happened to have with me. What still remained down in that hell hive, lurking and waiting for the thunder to arouse it, I did not know. 2 had been killed, perhaps that had finished it, but still there remained the burning determination to reach the innermost secret of the fear, which I had once more come to deem definite, material, and organic. My indecisive speculation, which to explore the passage alone and immediately with my pocket light, or to try to assemble a band of squatters for the quest, was interrupted after a time by a sudden rush of wind from the outside, which blew out the candle and left me in stark blackness. The moon no longer shone through the kinks of the apertures above me, and with a sense of fateful alarm, I heard the sinister and significant rumble of approaching thunder. A confession of associated ideas possessed my brain, leading me to grope backwards toward the farthest corner of the cellar. My eyes, however, never turned away from the horrible openings of the base of the chimney, and I began to get glimpses of the crumbling bricks and unhealthy weeds as faint glowing lightning penetrated the woods of outward and illuminated the kinks of the upper wall. Every second I consumed with a mixture of fear and curiosity. What would the storm call forth? Or was there anything left for it to call? Guided by a lightning flash, I settled myself down behind a dense clump of vegetation through which I could see the openings without being seen. If heaven is merciful, it will someday efface from my consciousness the sight that I saw and let me live my last years in peace. I cannot sleep at night now and have to take opiates when it thunders. The thing came abruptly and unannounced, a demon, rat-like scurrying from the pits remote and unimaginable, a hellish panting and stifling grunting, and then, from the opening beneath the chimney, a burst of multitudinous and leprous life, a loathsome night-sprawled flood of organic corruption, more devastatingly hideous than the blackest corruption of immortal madness and morbidity. Seething, stewing, surging, bubbling like serpent slime, it rolled up and out of that yawning hole, spread like septic contagion, and streaming with the cellar of every point of egress streaming out to scatter through the accursed midnight forest that strew fear, madness, and death. God knows how many there were. There must have been thousands. To see the streams of them in that faint, intermittent lightning was shocking. When they thinned out enough to be glimpsed as separate organisms, I saw that they were dwarfed, deformed, hairy devils or apes, monstrous, diabolic characters of the monkey tribe. They were so hideously silent, there was hardly a squeal when one of the last stragglers turned with the skill of a long practice to make a meal in accustomed fashion on a weaker companion. Others snapped up what is left and ate with savoring relish. Then, in spite of my days of fright and disgust, my morbid curiosity triumphed, and as the last of the monstrosities oozed up alone from their netherworld of unknown nightmare, I drew my automatic pistol and shot it under cover of the thunder. Shrieking, slithering, torrential shadows of red, vicious madness chased one another through endless and anguished corridors of purple, fearless sky, formless phantasms and kaleidoscope mutations of a ghoulish, remembered scene, forest of monstrous, overnourished oak and serpent roots twisted and suckling unnameable juices, with an earth feminist with millions of cannibal devils, mound-like tentacles groping from underground nuclei populous reversion, insane lightning over malignant ivied walls, and demon arcades choked with fungus vegetation. Heaven be thanked for the instinct which led me unconscious to places where men dwelt, to the peaceful village that slept under the calm stars of the clearing skies. I had recovered enough in a week to send to Albany for a gang of men to blow up the Martins mansion and the entire top of Tempest Mountain with dynamite, stop up all the discoverable mound burrows, and destroy uncertain, overnourished trees whose very existence seemed to insult to sanity. I could sleep a little after they had done this, but true rest will never come as long as I remember that nameless secret of the lurking fear. The thing will haunt me, for who can say the extermination is complete, and that angulous phenomenon do not exist all over the world? Who can, with my knowledge, think of the earth's unknown caverns without a nightmare dread of future possibilities? I cannot see well, or for a subway entrance without shuddering? Why cannot the doctors give me something to make me sleep or truly calm my brain when it thunders? What I saw in the glow of my flashlight after I shot the unspeakable straggling object was so simple that almost a minute elapsed before I understood and went delirious. The object was nauseous, filthy, whitish, gorilla thing with the sharp yellow fangs and matted fur. It was the ultimate product of mammalian degeneration, the frightful outcome of isolated spawning, multiplication, then cannibal nutrition above and below the ground, the embodiment of all the snarling chaos and grinning fear that lurked behind it. It had looked at me as it died, and its eyes had the same odd quality that marked those other eyes, which had stared at me underground, and excited cloudy recollections. One eye was blue, the other brown. They were the similar Martinese eyes of the old legends, and I knew, in one unending cataclysm of voiceless horror, what had become of that vanished family, the terrible and thunder-crazed house of Martinese. And so, darling, the storm passes. The night grows still, and the shadows return to their silent watch. But some stories linger long after the last word is spoken. Lovecraft has a talent for reminding us that the world is far older and far stranger than we like to believe, and that sometimes the most terrible truths are buried just beneath the surface, waiting patiently in the dark. If you enjoyed wandering into the unknown with me tonight, I would be delighted if you would left a like, subscribe to the channel, or share this story with other souls who enjoy the quiet side of horror. And if you have a favorite tale by Lovecraft you'd like to hear next, tell me in the comments. I may just choose it for a future night like this. Until we meet again, sleep well, darling. And remember, some things are safest left in the shadows. Good night.